My stepson just sold his tech company for $40 million. 2 hours later, he sat at the oak dining table I built with my own hands, pushed a brochure for a luxury senior resort toward me and said, "Martin, it's time to face reality. This house is a relic, and you don't fit the new brand. Pack your things. I've already called the movers." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just leaned back in my chair, looked him right in those expensive designer sunglasses, and told him one thing. That one sentence made his face go as gray as a concrete slab. I was about to show him that while he might own the servers, I still owned the ground he was standing on. He was so blinded by his new millions that he didn't realize he'd just tried to demolish a load-bearing wall without checking the blueprints. Welcome to the channel. Before we dive into how it all went down, hit like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments. Have you ever had someone mistake your kindness for weakness? A quick note, this is a fictional story with dramatized elements designed to share a meaningful lesson about respect and legacy. Any resemblance to real names or situations is purely coincidental. But the lesson? That's as real as it gets. Ryan told me I had 30 days to clear out. I just smiled, because he didn't know about the clause I'd buried in the deed 3 years ago. Hello, my name is Martin Caldwell. I'm 67 years old, and I spent 40 years as a construction supervisor. I've overseen the pouring of foundations for skyscrapers and the framing of homes that will stand for a century. In my line of work, you learn that a structure is only as good as the integrity of its base. You learn to spot a crack before it becomes a collapse, and you never, ever sign off on a project until you've read every single line of the safety code. I've spent my life making sure things are built to last. I just never realized the most important inspection I'd ever perform would be on my own family. I've always believed that you can tell everything you need to know about a man by looking at the house he builds for his family. For me, that wasn't just a metaphor, it was a physical reality. I spent 40 years in construction, but the most important project of my life began 32 years ago on a wooded plot of land that everyone else said was too stubborn to clear. I spent my weekends and every spare hour after the site whistle blew pouring my sweat into this foundation. I leveled the sills, raised the framing, and hammered every single nail with the kind of precision that only comes when you're building a sanctuary. When I met Elaine, she was a young widow with a 5-year-old boy named Ryan and a look in her eyes that said she'd forgotten what it felt like to be on solid ground. I didn't just want to be her husband, I wanted to be her foundation. I remember the day I carried her over the threshold of this house. The smell of fresh sawdust and floor wax was still thick in the air. Ryan was trailing behind us, clutching a plastic toy truck, looking up at the high ceilings with wide, uncertain eyes. I knelt down to his level that afternoon and pointed to the main support beam in the center of the living room. I told him, "Ryan, that's a load-bearing wall. It holds up the roof so we can sleep safe at night. As long as that stands, we're okay." I wanted him to feel the permanence of it. In those early days, money was tight. We ate a lot of casseroles and skipped vacations, but the house was full of life. I taught Ryan how to use a level, how to respect the grain of the wood, and how to finish a job once you started it. He was a bright kid, always asking instead of how, his mind already moving faster than his hands could keep up with. I watched him grow from a quiet boy into an ambitious young man within these walls. I celebrated his graduations in the backyard I'd leveled by hand and helped him move his first computer desk into the basement where he'd eventually start his first company. Back then, he thanked me for the space. Back then, he understood that the only reason he could reach for the clouds was because his feet were planted on the floor I had laid for him. I thought I was building a legacy that would outlast me, a structure of love and mutual respect. I didn't realize that while I was busy reinforcing the exterior, a slow rot was starting to take hold of the boy I had called my son. By the time Ryan hit his late 20s, the quiet hum of the house had changed. It was no longer the sound of a boy playing with trucks or a teenager listening to music, it was the frantic, rhythmic tapping of keys late into the night. Ryan had a vision for a software platform that he claimed would change the way small businesses handled logistics. He had the intellect and the drive, but he was hitting a wall that no amount of late-night coding could break through. He lacked the capital for the high-end server racks and infrastructure needed to scale. I remember sitting with him in the kitchen, the same oak table between us where he would eventually try to sign my life away. He looked exhausted, his hair unkempt, his eyes bloodshot from staring at blue light screens. He told me he was out of options. The banks wouldn't look at a kid with no collateral, and his angel investors had all flown south. Elaine sat nearby, her hands twisting her apron, her eyes pleading with me to do something. In the construction world, if you want a structure to reach higher, you have to deepen the foundation. You have to be willing to pour more resources into the ground where no one can see them. I had already paid off the house 3 years early, a point of pride that represented 40 years of calloused hands and missed sleep. But as I looked at my stepson, I didn't see a business risk. I saw a son who needed a load-bearing wall to lean on. The next morning, I walked into the local credit union and did something my father would have called temporary insanity. I took out a second mortgage on the house I had built from the dirt up. I remember the weight of the pen in my hand as I signed the documents. It felt like I was putting a crack in my own peace of mind, but I did it willingly. I handed Ryan a check for $80,000, the entirety of my home's equity and a significant portion of my retirement security. He didn't just thank me, he cried. He promised me that he would pay it back tenfold, that he would make sure Elaine and I never had to worry about a bill again for the rest of our lives. He called me his hero. I didn't need the money back, and I certainly didn't need to be a hero. I just wanted to be the man who made sure the people he loved had the chance to stand tall. I believed that by investing in his dream, I was reinforcing our family bond. I thought I was buying us a future together. I didn't realize I was actually handing him the tools he would eventually use to try and dismantle everything I had built. Success has a funny way of acting like a solvent. It dissolves the layers of a person until you see what's truly underneath. For a few years, the second mortgage felt like a shared secret, a silent bond between Martin and the boy he was helping to soar. Then, the silicon spark ignited. Ryan's logistics platform didn't just grow, it exploded. The tapped-out kid in the kitchen was replaced by a man in tailored navy suits who spent more time on conference calls than he did at the family table. At first, we celebrated. I felt a sense of quiet pride seeing him featured in tech journals, knowing that the foundation for those accolades was poured right here in this house. But as the money began to pour in, the atmosphere in our home began to shift. The humility that had defined Ryan's early struggles started to evaporate, replaced by a polished, impenetrable arrogance. He stopped asking for advice and started giving orders, treating the house like a temporary staging area rather than a home. Then came Courtney. She arrived on Ryan's arm like a curated accessory, sharp, stylish, and perpetually unimpressed. She was an image consultant by trade, but it didn't take long to realize her primary project was Ryan himself. To Courtney, everything was a brand, and our home was a liability. I'd catch her tracing the grain of the oak table I'd built with a look of polite disdain, or whispering to Ryan about curbing the aesthetic, while glancing at my old construction boots by the door. She spoke in the language of upgrades and optics. I remember sitting on the porch one evening, the smell of cedar in the air, when I heard her voice through the open window. "Ryan, darling, look at this place. It's charming in a rustic way, but it's not the home of a CEO. It's a construction worker's house. You're playing in a different league now. You need a space that reflects your status, not your past." I waited for Ryan to defend the walls that had sheltered him, or the man who had mortgaged his future to fund his dream. Instead, there was a long, chilling silence. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked the warmth I had known for 30 years. "You're right," he said. "It's getting a bit crowded in here. We need to think about the next phase." I felt a cold draft, even though it was mid-July. I realized then that Courtney wasn't just whispering about decor, she was whispering about disposal. Ryan wasn't just looking for a new house, he was looking for a new identity, one that didn't include a retired supervisor with silver hair and calloused hands. The boy I had raised was being replaced by a brand, and in their world, there was no room for old foundations. The following spring, Ryan staged what he called a family appreciation dinner, though the air in the room felt more like a press conference than a home-cooked meal. He'd hired a private chef to work in the kitchen I'd built, and Courtney had filled the house with minimalist floral arrangements that made the place look like a high-end funeral parlor. Midway through the main course, Ryan stood up, his face glowing with the practiced warmth of a man who knew he was being watched, even if it was only by us. With a flourish, he produced a thick envelope and slid it across the oak table toward me. "Martin," he said, his voice carrying a resonant, corporate weight. "You stepped up for me when nobody else would. You put this house on the line so I could build my future. Today, I'm returning the favor." Inside was a confirmation of a wire transfer. The second mortgage, along with the original bank loan, had been paid in full. Elaine gasped, her eyes shimmering with tears as she threw her arms around Ryan. For a moment, the old warmth returned to my chest. I felt a profound sense of relief, thinking the debt that had weighed on my shoulders was finally cleared. Ryan then placed a second set of documents on the table, along with a sleek, heavy pen. "There's just some logistical cleanup, Martin. Since I've settled the debt, we're moving the title into a family trust for tax optimization and protection. It's just a formality. Courtney's legal team vetted everything. It keeps the house safe and in the family name. I've spent 40 years reading blueprints where a single misplaced decimal point can cause a bridge to buckle, but that night, I was blinded by a father's pride. I saw my wife's joy and my stepson's apparent gratitude, and for the first time in my career, I didn't perform a structural inspection of the fine print. I signed where he pointed. I thought I was signing a document that secured our legacy. I didn't realize I was signing a transfer of title that stripped me of my ownership. As the evening ended, Courtney gave me a sharp, triumphant smile that didn't reach her eyes. Ryan shook my hand, but his grip felt different. Less like a son and more like a landlord. I went to bed that night feeling a weight had been lifted, unaware that I had actually handed him the keys to the demolition crane. I had built this house to be a sanctuary, but with one stroke of a pen, I'd turned my own foundation into a house of cards. The acquisition of Ryan's company was finalized on a Tuesday, and by Friday, the atmosphere in the house had turned into something unrecognizable. It was no longer a home, it was a stage. Ryan had officially become a titan of the tech industry, and Courtney had wasted no time in curating a guest list of venture capitalists and local influencers to celebrate the Callaway legacy. That evening, I felt like a stranger in the very rooms I had framed with my own hands. Courtney had hired a catering crew that swarmed the kitchen, pushing Elaine aside as she tried to prepare her famous roast. The oak dining table was draped in white linen so thick it hid the wood entirely, a deliberate choice, I realized, to mask the blue-collar craftsmanship Courtney so despised. As the guests arrived, the air became thick with the scent of expensive perfume and talk of disruption and exit strategies. Ryan moved through the crowd with a practiced, hollow laugh, his eyes never quite meeting mine. Whenever he did glance my way, it wasn't with the pride of a son, but with the mounting anxiety of a man who found an old, dented tool left out on a pristine workbench. The breaking point came during the main course. I had reached for the wine decanter when Courtney leaned over, her voice a sharp, modulated whisper that cut through the clinking of silver. "Martin, dear, why don't you let the staff handle the heavy lifting tonight? You've done so much for this house, you really should just sit back and stay out of the way." She didn't say the word servant, but it hung in the air between us, heavy and unmistakable. Ryan didn't blink. He just nodded in agreement, turning back to a woman in a sharp blazer to discuss his next series of investments. "My stepfather is old school," Ryan told her, his voice devoid of any warmth. "He's great with his hands, but he doesn't quite grasp the speed of the modern world. We're actually looking into some much more appropriate accommodations for him and my mother." I looked at Elaine. She was sitting at the far end of the table, her head bowed, picking at her food while a guest talked over her as if she were part of the furniture. My blood didn't boil, it turned to ice. I realized that to them, I had become a relic, a piece of outdated hardware that was slowing down their new high-speed life. They treated me like hired help in the house I had bled for, but as I watched Ryan toast to his own brilliance, I remembered something about structures that he had clearly forgotten. You can paint over the walls and cover the tables, but if you don't respect the load-bearing integrity of the man who built them, the whole thing is liable to come crashing down. I sat there in silence, a construction supervisor watching a disaster in progress, waiting for the right moment to call for a total site inspection. The following morning, the white linens were gone, but the chill in the house remained. I was in the kitchen, brewing a pot of coffee and looking out at the backyard I had leveled by hand, when the heavy tread of designer loafers echoed on the hardwood. Ryan walked in, followed closely by Courtney. She was already holding a tablet, her eyes scanning digital floor plans as if the walls around her had already ceased to exist. Ryan didn't sit down. He stood by the island, checking his watch, a habit of a man whose time was now too expensive for small talk. "Martin, we need to talk about the next phase I mentioned last night," he began, his voice flat and efficient. "Courtney and I have been looking at the portfolio. This land is underutilized. The market in this zip code has shifted, and a developer reached out with an offer for the lot that we simply can't ignore." I felt a slight tremor in my hands, but I kept them flat on the counter. "The lot, Ryan? This is a home. Your mother's home." "It's an asset, Martin," Courtney interjected, not looking up from her screen. "And frankly, the maintenance costs on a structure of this age are inefficient. We've already signed the intent to sell. A crew will be here in a few weeks to begin the teardown. We're going to build a high-spec, modern smart home, something that reflects Ryan's new standing." Ryan finally looked at me, but there was no recognition in his eyes, only the cold calculation of a man who had successfully disrupted his own upbringing. "I've already picked out a top-tier assisted living community for you and Mom. It's got 24-hour staff, golf, the works. I'll be handling all the expenses, of course. Consider it your final retirement gift." He slid a single sheet of paper across the granite. It wasn't a gift, it was a move-out schedule. 30 days. "You're throwing us out of the house I built for you?" I asked, my voice low, like the rumble of distant machinery. "Technically, Martin, I'm liquidating an interest in a property I legally own," Ryan replied, his tone sharpening. "You signed the transfer of title. The house is in the trust, and as the sole trustee, I've decided to move in a different direction. It's just business. I'd suggest you start packing the essentials. Anything left behind when the demolition crew arrives will be hauled to the landfill." He turned to leave, Courtney trailing behind him like a shadow. They walked away with the confidence of people who believe that a signature on a piece of paper can erase 40 years of structural integrity. I stood there in the silence, looking at the 30-day countdown. Ryan thought he was a master of the exit strategy, but he had made a classic rookie mistake. He had assumed the man who poured the foundation didn't know exactly where the hidden supports were located. He thought he was giving me a demolition order, but all he'd really done was give me the signal to begin the most important inspection of my life. I didn't waste time arguing with a man who thought a tailored suit made him a master of the trade. Instead, I grabbed my old leather briefcase, the one that had sat in the hall closet since my retirement, and drove down to a small, unassuming office on the edge of town. It belonged to Arthur Vance, a man who had been my lawyer and friend since we were both young men just starting to pour the foundations of our careers. Arthur was a dirt lawyer, a specialist in real estate and titles who knew the history of every acre in this county. I laid the documents Ryan had pushed across the table in front of him. I told him about the formality, the family trust, and the 30-day demolition order. Arthur put on his spectacles, his brow furrowing as he began to scan the dense legalese that Ryan's high-priced Silicon Valley team had drafted. For a long time, the only sound in the room was the ticking of a clock and the rhythmic rustle of paper. "They're good, Martin," Arthur muttered, tapping a page with his pen. "They've built a very sophisticated cage. On the surface, it looks like you've signed away every right you have to this property. They've moved the title to a corporate entity where Ryan is the sole director. From a tech mogul's perspective, you're just a tenant at will." My heart sank into my boots. I looked out the window, thinking of Elaine's face and the house I had promised her would be our final port. But then Arthur stopped. He flipped back 2 pages, squinting at a paragraph buried in a section regarding incidental easements and reversions. "Wait," he whispered, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face. "In your original deed, the one you had me draft 30 years ago, you insisted on a specific life estate reservation. When Ryan's team drafted this new transfer, They referenced the original deed and all its encumbrances to save time on the title search. They thought they were being efficient. But because they didn't explicitly revoke the life estate in the new signature block, the reservation holds. He looked up at me, his eyes sharp. Martin, you don't just have a right to stay here. As long as you are drawing breath, you are the life tenant. Ryan can own the dirt, and he can own the future, but he cannot touch a single shingle on that roof without your written consent. And he certainly can't bring a demolition crew onto the property. It was the ultimate structural oversight. Ryan had focused on the flashy architecture of his new wealth, but he'd failed to inspect the original deep piling supports of the contract. I felt the familiar weight of my old authority returning to my shoulders. I wasn't just a guest, I was the load-bearing wall. Can we stop the sale? I asked. Arthur leaned back, folding his hands. We can do more than that. We can freeze his entire development project. And if he's already promised this land to a developer, he's about to find himself in a very expensive breach of contract. I thanked Arthur and walked back to my truck. For the first time in weeks, the air felt clear. Ryan wanted a demolition. He was about to find out what happens when you try to tear down a house that's still got its master builder standing inside. The following week, the air in the house was thick with a different kind of tension, the kind that precedes a controlled demolition. Ryan and Courtney had already started tagging furniture with color-coded stickers, acting as if the walls were already transparent. I didn't stop them. Instead, I used my leverage to suggest a final legacy gala. I told Ryan that since he was moving on to bigger things, he should host his new board of directors at the home where it all began. It was a play to his ego, and like a poorly braced beam under too much weight, he buckled instantly. The night of the event, the house was filled with the heavy hitters of the tech world, men and women who dealt in ethics ratings and public perception. They stood on my hand-polished floors, sipping champagne and listening to Ryan give a speech about how his humble beginnings had shaped his corporate integrity. Courtney stood beside him, radiant and sharp, already looking past the guests toward the modern mansion she thought was her birthright. When the applause died down, I stepped forward. I didn't need a microphone. My voice had been trained to carry across noisy construction sites for decades. I'd like to add something to Ryan's story, I said, my calm blue eyes locked onto his. The room went quiet. I saw the first flicker of uncertainty cross his face, a hairline fracture in his polished facade. Ryan talked about foundations tonight. I continued, pulling a folder from the sideboard. But a foundation is only as good as the honesty of the man who lays it. You see, Ryan recently told me that this house, his mother's home, is being demolished in 30 days. He told his board he was liquidating underutilized assets. What he didn't tell them was that he tried to do it by fraudulently bypassing a life estate clause. I handed a copy of Arthur's legal brief to the chairman of the board. He's currently in breach of contract with your development partners because he's trying to sell land he doesn't have the legal right to clear. And he's doing it by attempting to evict his own retired parents. The silence that followed was absolute. I watched as the board members, the people Ryan spent every waking hour trying to impress, looked at him with a mixture of disgust and corporate alarm. In their world, a scandal involving elder abuse and title fraud was a poison pill. Courtney's face went as pale as the lilies she'd ordered. Ryan tried to speak, to pivot, or rebrand the situation, but the words died in his throat. I leaned in close, my voice a low rumble that only he could hear. You forgot the first rule of the job site, Ryan. Never try to tear down a house while the master builder is still standing in the room. The foundation hadn't just held, it had trapped him. The next phase wasn't a mansion, it was a total collapse of the brand he had sacrificed his soul to build. The following morning, the house was silent in a way it hadn't been since the acquisition. The catering crews were gone, the board members had vanished into their waiting limousines, and the heavy white linens had been stripped away, leaving the oak table bare and exposed once more. Ryan sat at that table, his designer suit rumpled and his head in his hands. He looked less like a tech titan and more like the boy who used to cry over a broken toy truck. The scandal had hit the wire services by dawn. The board had issued a morality and ethics ultimatum. Settle the dispute with his family immediately and quietly, or face a vote of no confidence that would strip him of his CEO title. I sat opposite him, Arthur's final settlement papers resting between us. "I didn't think you'd actually do it," Ryan whispered, his voice cracking. "I thought we were just optimizing. Moving forward." "You weren't moving forward, Ryan. You were trying to build on top of someone else's rubble," I replied. I didn't feel the surge of anger I expected. I just felt the weary clarity of a man who had finished a long, difficult shift. "You tried to use a formality to steal a foundation. Now, we're going to use a formality to restore it." The terms were non-negotiable. Ryan was to sign a full quitclaim deed, returning the house and the land to me and Elaine, free and clear of the trust. He was also required to pay off any remaining liens and provide a formal apology to the board to save his own career. As he reached for the pen, the front door swung open. Courtney marched in, her heels clicking like a countdown on the hardwood. She didn't look at Elaine or me. She looked straight at Ryan with a cold, clinical detachment. Behind her, two movers began carrying out the minimalist sculptures and brand-appropriate decor she had used to colonize our home. The developer pulled out, "Ryan," she said, her voice like ice. "The board is freezing your bonus structure until the audit is complete. The penthouse in the city is off the table." "Courtney, wait," Ryan started, standing up. "We can still make this work. We can find another lot." "With what reputation?" she snapped. "I don't represent disgraced sons. I represent winners. You're not a visionary anymore, Ryan. You're a liability." She turned on her heel and walked out, leaving the door standing open. She didn't care about the man. She only cared about the structure he could provide. When the mansion plan collapsed, she treated him exactly how he had treated me, like an outdated piece of hardware to be discarded. Ryan watched her go, then slowly sat back down. He picked up the pen and signed the deed. The scratch of the ink on the paper was the sound of the foundation finally settling back into place. He slid the papers toward me, his face hollow. He had his millions, but he had lost his home in every sense of the word. I took the documents and stood up. The house was mine again, not because I wanted the property, but because some things are built to last, and they deserve to be protected by the man who knows their worth. The following weeks were quiet, the kind of silence that follows a massive storm when you finally step outside to survey the landscape. I spent most of my mornings on the front porch with Elaine, the two of us sitting in the cedar swings I'd built back when my hair was still dark and my joints didn't ache with the changing weather. The air felt lighter, the for sale signs and the stench of designer perfume having long since drifted away. We sat there in the soft amber light of late afternoon, watching the shadows of the tall pines stretch across the driveway I'd paved a lifetime ago. The sound of a car engine, not the high-pitched whine of a sports car, but something modest and rented, broke the stillness. A silver sedan pulled into the drive, and Ryan stepped out. He wasn't wearing a navy suit or designer sunglasses. He looked smaller, his shoulders slumped under a plain cotton shirt, his polished confidence replaced by a hesitant, heavy gait. He walked up the path I'd leveled, his eyes fixed on the porch steps as if he were afraid they might give way beneath him. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at us. "Martin," he said, his voice barely a murmur. There was no talk of acquisitions or luxury resorts. He stood there for a long time, just looking at the house, really looking at it, perhaps seeing the craftsmanship and the sacrifice for the first time in a decade. "I lost a lot," he finally said, his voice cracking. "Not just the money or the brand. I lost the only place where I was ever actually safe. I'm starting over and I don't know where the foundation is anymore." Elaine looked at me, her green eyes shimmering with a mother's eternal hope, but she waited. She knew that in this house, I was the one who checked the structural integrity. I looked at the boy I had raised, seeing the cracks and the weathering he'd brought upon himself. I didn't feel the need to tear him down further, the world had already done that. But I also knew that a foundation once broken takes a long time to cure. "A house isn't built in a day, Ryan," I said, my voice calm and steady. "And trust takes even longer." I stood up and held the screen door open, a simple gesture that carried the weight of 30 years. "You can come in for dinner. Your mother made the roast you used to like." He started toward the door, a glimmer of relief in his eyes, but I held up a hand, stopping him just for a second. But remember, Ryan, you're a guest in this house now. And in this home, we respect the man who built the walls. He nodded, a single solemn movement of his head, and stepped over the threshold. As the door clicked shut behind us, I felt the house settle. The structures we build with our hands are important, but the ones we build with our character are the ones that truly last. We walked into the kitchen together, on solid ground at last. You know, I've spent 40 years in the dirt and the dust of construction sites. And if there's one thing 40 years will teach you, it's this. Never judge the strength of a building by its fresh coat of paint or how many millions it's worth on paper. You judge a structure by what's buried in the mud where nobody bothered to look. The vital lesson I've gained from this journey is that integrity is the only load-bearing wall that matters. In my career, I saw plenty of developers try to cut corners. They'd swap out high-grade steel for the cheap stuff or rush the curing process just to save a buck. They thought they could hide those cracks behind fancy granite countertops and crown molding. But here's the thing about reality, it has a way of settling. And when the weight finally comes down, if that foundation is built on a lie, the whole house is going to buckle. No matter how much you paid for it. I made a mistake with Ryan. I thought that because I provided the infrastructure, the roof over his head, the tuition, the loans, that our bond was solid. I was so busy looking at the framing of his success that I didn't notice the rot of entitlement eating away at his character. But I also learned that being old-fashioned doesn't mean being a doormat. Ryan thought my silver hair meant I was obsolete. He forgot that the master builder always keeps a copy of the original blueprints. By knowing my worth and reading the fine print, I didn't just save a house, I saved my dignity. If you're watching this right now, maybe you felt like a relic too. Maybe someone you helped build up is trying to tear you down. If that's you, I want you to remember, success can be manufactured overnight, but a legacy? That takes a lifetime to cure. Don't ever let someone with new money tell you that your core values are out of style. We tell stories like this every week, stories about standing your ground, protecting your legacy, and making sure the bad contractors of the world don't get the final word. If you believe that character still counts for something, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and join our community. We're building something here that's meant to last, and I'd be honored to have you on the site. Tap the bell so you don't miss the next inspection. Because at the end of the day, when the fair weather friends blow away and the market crashes, the only thing left standing is the truth you poured into the ground years ago. Drop a comment below and let me know, what's the one foundation in your life that you'll never let anyone tear down? I read every single one of them. Thanks for watching. Remember, keep your head high, your words solid, and always check the blueprints before you sign. I'll see you in the next story.